Reinforcement. Reinforcement is one of the biggest tools we'll be using as an RBT to work with your patients. Remember, for something to be considered reinforcement, it must have these two qualities. They both must be present. It must follow the behavior, therefore it is a consequence. And that behavior must increase in the future. So again, for something to be considered reinforcement, it must follow the behavior, therefore a consequence. And that behavior must increase in the future. There are two types of reinforcement that we are going to discuss: positive and negative reinforcement. Both increase the future likelihood of behavior. Positive reinforcement occurs when the behavior is reinforced due to the addition of a stimulus or reinforcer. For example, if I tell someone to clap their hands and they clap their hands, and I give them an M&M, and they are more likely in the future to clap their hands because I give them M&Ms, the M&M is acting as a positive reinforcer because the person is getting that M&M, they're gaining it. Negative reinforcement works on the removal of something the person doesn't like or an aversive stimulus. So, when my alarm clock goes off in the morning, my behavior of swiping the screen to turn the alarm clock off has been negatively reinforced. The behavior of swiping the screen removes the alarm clock going off. It removes the aversive stimulus. Reinforcement is based on the idea of operant behavior. Operant behavior: any behavior whose future frequency is determined by its history of consequences. In other words, a behavior that you do and how much you do it is based by what it gets you. Behaviors whose future likelihood is determined by what it gets or doesn't get the individual. Operant behavior. An example of operant behavior would be turning the water on in a faucet. You are not born knowing how to turn the sink handle to have water come out. But because of your history with it, turn handle, water comes out, you know how to do it. Imagine a world where sink handles did absolutely nothing. While some people might actually turn them, their rate would be much, much lower because it doesn't get anything. So again, operant behavior is based on what it gets or doesn't get the person. It's a learned history. You basically have to have a learning history with it. If you think about your or all of human development, a vast majority of behaviors that we are engaging in are operant. We learn how to do them because they get us something, or they remove something we don't like. None of us are born knowing how to operate an iPhone. None of us are born with some capability to automatically know how to use a computer or drive a car. These are all learned behaviors because of what it gets the person, or what it doesn't get them, or removes something that's bad. The idea of operant conditioning is based on what's known as a functional consequence, a stimulus change that follows a behavior closely and alters the frequency of that behavior in the future. What that means is that what happens after a behavior something happens. When you do that behavior, you get something or something is removed, and this alters how much you will do that in the future. So, a functional consequence is just something that when we engage in the behavior, something occurs that will either make us do the behavior more in the future or less in the future. Operant conditioning example. So, I press the button on the TV, the power button. TV turns on immediately. I am more likely to press that button in the future due to the stimulus change that pressing the button led to, the TV turning on. So remember, the behavior of pressing the power button, the frequency of me doing that is going to increase due to the fact that it causes the stimulus change, which is the TV turning on. You can think of a myriad of examples of what we do as humans, what you may do, that this applies to. In 1953, B.F. Skinner was talking about operant conditioning. Whereas you strengthen an operant, it makes the response more probable and more frequent. If this sounds familiar, it's because this is the basis for reinforcement. When operant conditioning leads to an increase in response frequency, in other words, a behavior increases based on what it gets the person, either giving them something or removing something negative, we have that idea of reinforcement. Consequences, meaning after the behavior, right, only affect future behavior. We cannot tell if something was reinforced until we see if it actually increases based on the response or based on the consequence. So, if you're working with a patient and they have a new behavior, they engage in some new behavior, and you provide a reinforcing consequence for that, we cannot actually say whether that person was reinforced or not, because we don't know what the future likelihood of that behavior looks like. Likewise, an issue I see a lot is a kid will engage or a patient will engage in some new problem behavior, and the parent will say, I don't know what I did to reinforce that. But it's a new problem behavior. We don't know if it's going to happen again. We don't know if the person will actually engage in that behavior anymore. So we can't actually say we reinforced it. It could have just been a one-off behavior that day. The point is that when we're talking about consequences and reinforcement specifically, we are only talking about the future behavior. For something to be reinforcing, it has to affect future behavior. So, if I say that I'm going to give my kids $5 to clean their room to reinforce them, I am technically incorrect. I would have to wait and see if that $5 actually increases the future likelihood of them wanting to clean their room. So maybe I give them the $5 after they clean their room, and then the next time I ask them to clean their rooms, they don't do it. Or they complain, or they don't do it as well as I wanted them to. At that point, I could say the $5 was not reinforcing. But if I give them $5, so let's say in another example, I give them $5 to clean their room, and the next time I ask them to, they rapidly do it and they want to do it, I give them the $5. And then the next time I ask them and they even more want to clean their room, then I can say that $5 is acting as a reinforcer. The point is, though, as an RBT and for understanding this, reinforcement is only talking about, we can only know if it's reinforcement if we know about the future likelihood of the behavior. So, is this reinforcement? You give your patient access to their favorite toy for correctly identifying the color blue. Is it reinforcement? Well, let's see. It meets the first requirement. It comes after the behavior, identifying blue. But what about the second requirement? We don't know yet. We don't know if it's actually going to increase the likelihood of the behavior of them identifying blue. So we cannot say that you reinforced your patient. All we can say is that you provided them a consequence for identifying the color blue. But we cannot say that giving access to the toy was a reinforcement. We can only say that giving access to the toy was a consequence for them correctly identifying the color blue. So let's look at this example. Your patient is not attending to you. You show your patient a picture of his favorite cartoon character. He then gets 10 questions right in a row. Is showing the favorite cartoon character reinforcement? Well, let's see. The second criteria is met. The responses are increasing. He got 10 questions right in a row. Before, he'd only gotten 0 questions right. But showing the cartoon character was not a reinforcer because it was shown before the instructions were given. Therefore, it is not a consequence. Here, showing the cartoon character was more like an antecedent intervention. It basically got him to attend to your instructions. Therefore, it would not be a reinforcer because it was occurring before the behavior. It did not come after the behavior of picking the correct responses. So remember, both criteria have to be met. It has to increase the future likelihood of the behavior, and it has to come after a response. Here's another example of something that looks like reinforcement but is not. The RBT asks his patient to touch his head. The patient touches his head and the RBT provides a token and some social reinforcement. Great job touching your head. The patient then gets 80% correct on the trials. We don't know what the future likelihood of the behavior is, however. We only know that he got 80% correct this time. Maybe he got 100% yesterday, or maybe he'll only get 60% correct tomorrow. We don't know. The point is that we need to know what the future likelihood of the behavior is. In this example, the person, we only know they got 80% correct. That's all we know. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what happened yesterday. This is a reinforcement. The RBT asks his patient to touch his head. The patient touches his head, and the RBT provides a token and some social reinforcement. The patient then gets 80% correct on the trials. In the next set of trials, he also uses tokens to serve as reinforcement. The patient then gets 100% correct. So in this example, we can see that the correct rate, the frequency of the responding, is getting higher. It went from 80% to 100%. It is increasing the future likelihood of the behavior, and the tokens were coming after the behavior of the individual touching their head. Using reinforcement throughout the session. Remember, we are not just reinforcing correct responses to our questions. We should also be striving to reinforce the patient attending to us, wanting to be around us, and sitting and doing program, as well as engaging in any other good and desirable behaviors. Remember, as an RBT, you are providing an enriched environment. This means you are attending to things that most normal or typical environments would not attend to. And when I say that, I mean it is not a natural thing to tell a kid or tell a patient, good job for every little thing they do. But remember, we are providing an enriched environment where we are trying to build these skills up. And we know that reinforcement works throughout the day. So we need to attend to those little things that most people would not to build those skills up. Now, of course, you're not always going to be doing that. Once that person starts doing it more and more frequently, we can fade back all that kind of reinforcement. But the point is, as an RBT, you are providing an enriched environment. That means you are reinforcing behaviors that normal environments, natural environments, typically wouldn't pick up on or would just expect the person to be able to do. For example, look at eye contact. Most people expect people to make eye contact. But a person with autism or another developmental disability may have difficulty making eye contact. So, in an enriched environment, every time that person makes eye contact, you should throw a little party for them. Hey, great job looking at me. Awesome work. That's not something you would normally hear throughout the day in a normal environment, but because we are providing that enriched environment, we should strive to do that. During rapport building, try to find what works for that individual. Often, just being fun and playful, or making silly noises, or some sort of funny voice can be enough for that person to want to attend to you. Again, it's going to depend on the patient, and this involves lots of communication with both the supervisor of the case, the analyst, and other technicians working on that case. The point is, though, if you understand that reinforcement increases likelihood of behavior, we should be striving to use that for all desirable behaviors throughout the session, not just when we're working with stimuli or on programs. Reinforcement contingencies, or the idea of a contingency. A contingency is sort of like a contract. If you do this, you get this. When this happens, this happens. As an RBT, strive to be predictable and consistent. Don't let the patient control the session, but rather provide reinforcement type actions for the desirable behavior. Ignore or redirect undesirable behavior. Remember, as an RBT, you can't control the antecedents and the consequences. Don't let that person, the patient, get access to reinforcement or other desirable items for engaging in undesirable or problematic behavior. Remember, you are the RBT. The patient is not in control of the session. You are guiding the session. Yes, they are going to sometimes engage in behaviors that are problematic. It is your role as an RBT to use behavior management skills and reinforcement skills to promote desirable behavior and to ignore or redirect the undesirable behavior. And remember to develop those contingencies with the individual. If you do this, this will happen. First we do this, then this. Remember, a contingency is like a contract. Basically saying that when this happens, if you do this, this happens. Or when this happens, this happens. First, you have to do this, then this happens. So, what are reinforcers? Reinforcers are the items or activities or actions that you will use to reinforce correct responses. Honestly, they can be just about anything. I have used pictures of ceiling fans. I have used staplers. I have used marbles as reinforcers. I have used silly voices, drawings, toys, praise, just about anything. But of course, there are some considerations that you want to make. Reinforcers should be easy to deliver. They should be small enough to be able to transport or hide. Basically, you have to be able to be in control of them. They should not readily be available for that patient throughout the day. Otherwise, remember, they won't be in that deprivation state. I put on here they shouldn't be too pricey, because if we have to get them, right, if we have to buy some of them for reinforcement, we don't want to spend tons of money doing that. They shouldn't be something that are really that the person is really resistant to giving back once they have access to it. So if you use an item but they have a 10-minute tantrum every single time you have to get it back, then that's probably going to be counterproductive for the session. And it should be something that can be enjoyed for a few seconds, because you're probably going to have to get it back from them pretty quickly. Remember, we're trying to do as many trials as we possibly can. And something I didn't put on here is that they should be approved by the parent or the guardian. For example, I was working with a patient one time. Chocolate chips were very reinforcing for that patient. They would do just about anything for them. But the parent didn't want the person to eat sugar, so we had to stop. Even though they were good reinforcers, because the parent or guardian didn't want us to do it. Remember, it's their child. It's their patient. They are responsible for them. We listen to them. So that is one consideration you should definitely take as well. So, when to use reinforcement? We use reinforcement throughout the session. We use it for correct responses. At the beginning or for difficult tasks, we're probably going to be reinforcing every single correct response. For known responses, or stuff that is not difficult for the learner, we can do every 2 to 3 responses or more. Again, though, this is very difficult to say. I don't know what kind of patient you'll be working with. And remember, we can always give some sort of social response or some sort of acknowledgement that the person got it right. I use smiles and high fives and thumbs up a lot. The point is, though, is that for those hard tasks or difficult tasks, we want to give higher levels of reinforcement. And for known or easier tasks, probably lower levels or less frequent reinforcement. When not to use reinforcement. Of course, after they engage in a problem behavior, we don't want to reinforce problem behavior. One time when I was first doing this, a kid hit me on the head, and I basically said, "Ouch, that kind of hurt. Here, play with this while I write out this incident report." So I reinforced that child, that patient, for hitting me on the head. So again, we want to avoid using any kind of reinforcement when that person is engaging in problematic behavior. We don't want to inadvertently reinforce the problem behavior. As an RBT, you will use contingencies of reinforcement to work on skill acquisition, also known as teaching skills. Again, as an RBT, you will use this contingencies of reinforcement, to work on teaching them items that address the skill deficits in their lives. So basically, whatever they need help with, we're going to be using reinforcement contingencies to improve their skill set. Now, within reinforcement, there are 2 big types of schedules of reinforcement: variable or intermittent, and continuous. These general categories are going to be discussed next. Within intermittent reinforcement, there are 2 broad categories: ratio and intervals. Ratios are the number of responses needed. This means that we're going to give reinforcement dependent on the number of responses, whatever that is. So, we might say something like, we'll reinforce in a ratio of every 3 responses. So for every 3 correct responses, that person will get reinforced. Intervals, on the other hand, require a time frame. The reinforcement is dependent on the amount of time passing. Okay, once that time is passed, the first correct behavior after that time is reinforced. Okay, we might say something like, we're going to reinforce every target item, or we're going to reinforce one target item after the 3 minutes. So And then after that correct response, we start the 3-minute interval again. So again, we reinforce the first correct target behavior after the interval. Once that's happened, we start the interval over. Variable or intermittent reinforcement means that we're not giving reinforcement for every response. This is good for responses that are already established, or the person already has the skills in their repertoire, or the skill is very easy for them. Here's what an example of what intermittent reinforcement might look like. We provide Jerry with reinforcement for every few responses in this example. So the RBT says, "Where's the car?" The patient touches the car. Then they say, "Where's the horse?" The patient touches the horse. The RBT reinforces. "Where's the house?" The patient touches house. "Where's the airplane?" The patient touches the airplane. And then finally the RBT says, "Where's the apple?" And the patient touches the apple. And the RBT reinforces. So as you can see here, the RBT is not reinforcing every correct response. This would be intermittent reinforcement. Variable reinforcement on a fixed ratio. This establishes the criteria for number of responses and stays consistent. So if it is a fixed ratio of 3, also denoted by FR3, we're going to reinforce every third correct response. For example, I would say touch nose, they would touch nose, touch eye, they touch eyes, and then say touch ears, and once they touch ears, I would say, "Hey, awesome job, you know your body parts." Okay, so I'm reinforcing every third correct response. A variable ratio, on the other hand, also establishes the criteria for number of responses, and this will also stay consistent. Okay, so if it is a variable ratio 5, VR5, we're going to reinforce, on average, every 5th response. So that could be the 7th response or the 3rd response. It could be the 10th or the 1st. As long as over the time frame that you're doing this, it averages out to 5. Variable reinforcement and variable ratio can produce a very strong response rate. If you think about gambling, okay, why do people continue to gamble, or why do you flip through Netflix? At some point, I don't know what a good example of this, but what is actually a good example? Because every once in a while it pays off. Okay, going through Netflix, every once in a while you find a really good movie that you want to watch. Okay. This type of variable reinforcement is going to be very strong. Okay, because it produces strong responses because it pays off every once in a while. The point in variable ratio, though, is that ratio stays consistent. You have a VR5, so that means on average every 5th response. So like I said, it could be the 1st response or the 10th response. There's also the fixed interval. Okay. So if it's a fixed interval, say fixed interval 2, we're going to reinforce the first correct response after 2 minutes. So after the correct response, the interval starts over. In variable interval, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to reinforce after a certain amount of time, but on average it's going to be that like 3 minutes. Okay, so if we have a VI3, which is variable interval 3, we're going to reinforce after intervals to average out to 3 minutes. So some of those intervals might be 2 minutes, some may be 5, some may be 6, some may be 1. Just needs to average out to 3. So you have intermittent reinforcement, which is not reinforcing every response. And within that you have ratio and interval. The second kind of type of reinforcement you may use is continuous reinforcement, where we're going to reinforce every correct response. This is great for acquisition and target skills. It's great for new behavior plan target behaviors, where we're going to reinforce every desired behavior. It's great for difficult skills. And it's what we usually use social reinforcement during airless learning. So an example right now for me is my son is learning how to swim. For my other 2 kids, every time they go underwater and move a little bit, I'm not telling them good job, I'm not telling them it's something they already know how to do. It's great, it's great they know how to do it. But for my little guy who's learning to swim, I am heaping on the praise every single time he does, because it's a new skill for him. It's difficult for him. Schedules of reinforcement in the RBT. As the RBT, I want you to be familiar with the schedule reinforcement for the program is. Newer items or acquisition items should be reinforced continuously, each correct response. Newer behavior goals should also be reinforced continuously. But again, this could depend on the patient. I can't say that as an all-the-time rule, but for the most part, newer items or acquisition items are going to be reinforced continuously. Variable reinforcement keeps behavior strong, but fades out reinforcers. Remember, in variable reinforcement, you're not being reinforced for every correct response. This keeps behavior strong, but we can fade out reinforcers over time. Just like we fade out prompts, or extra stimulus prompts, or extra help, we can also fade out reinforcement. After all, as good as this world might sound, we're not going to be following people around M&Ms and saying, great job for every single thing they do. So again, we have to fade out reinforcement, and variable reinforcement is a great tool for that. Our society mostly is based on variable reinforcement. If you think about paychecks are a variable reinforcement that's based on a fixed interval, right? After a certain amount of time, you get reinforced. Okay? But again, continuous reinforcement also helps us to learn new skills or to get that big project done. Another thing I want you to understand is you can use more than one at a time for different types of reinforcement. For example, I will use continuous reinforcement schedule in regards to social reinforcement and variable one in regards to tangibles. I'll say good job or fantastic work, etc. for correct responses, but I'll give a favorite toy or candy for every few responses. And likewise, when I work with older patients, or I work with patients who obviously know how to do some things or have already got a lot of skills in repertoire, I'm not going to reinforce them every single time with things. I'm going to give them variable reinforcement. But again, as the RBT, it is your job to be familiar with that in the protocol, but to also understand the kind of thinking behind this. Another thing I want you to realize is that variable reinforcement schedules work well to maintain good behavior, and we discussed that already, but they also work just as well to maintain undesired behavior. Remember, variably reinforced behavior persists because it pays off every once in a while. My daughter actually has a pretty big issue with this. Okay, she will ask, and someone will tell her no. But because in her learning history, if she's persistent and she asks again maybe a couple minutes later, or puts on those cute eyes or whatever she does, every once in a while her continuing to do that pays off. Okay, and I'm guilty of that, and grandparent stuff as well. But the point is that I've let that pay off every once in a while. Okay, once I realized that, I started to be a little more consistent in how I implemented or consistent in how I responded. But the point being, though, is that variably reinforced behavior will persist because it pays off every once in a while. Just like my daughter, the individual may keep pushing until they get what they want, especially if that has worked in the past. Okay, this is why consistency is highly important in intervening on problem behavior. This is why we strive to be as consistent as possible in implementing the behavior plan. Reinforcement comes in two flavors, conditioned or unconditioned. Unconditioned reinforcement does not require learning history to have reinforcing qualities. Think of it as a more inherent thing. Things such as food, warmth, water, some forms of human interaction. These are unlearned. We're kind of born with them. You can think of it kind of as an innate thing to innate. These are also known in ABA terminology as a primary reinforcer. Again, unconditioned reinforcement does not require the learning history to have reinforcing qualities. It is more inherent. When an infant is born, they engage in behaviors that seek out the mother's breast milk or some sort of food. They do not need to learn how to do that. Food is a good thing. It's desirable. Conditioned reinforcement. This requires a learning history. Previously neutral stimuli, become a reinforcer through association or pairing with established reinforcers. This takes place over time. This is also known as secondary reinforcement or secondary reinforcers. Stickers, tokens, toys, those are all examples of secondary reinforcers. Stickers, a star sticker to someone who's never seen one or has no experience with it getting them anything, is a totally neutral stimuli. It doesn't mean anything to them. They could probably care less. But if every time they get 5 stickers on a chart, they get a favorite toy or a favorite food, it starts to become reinforcing. And they start to work for those stickers. A special kind of conditioned reinforcer is a generalized conditioned reinforcer. This is paired with many conditioned and unconditioned reinforcers. Money, tokens, points are examples of this. Remember, money, a $20 bill to someone who's never seen it, is going to be neutral. Doesn't mean anything. For example, when my 2-year-old, when we were getting him a birthday present, a $20 bill would have meant nothing to him. He didn't care about that. He didn't understand at that time that money got him anything. My 10-year-old would have loved a $20 bill because he knows what it means. To my 2-year-old, money was a neutral stimulus. But now that he's a little bit older, he totally understands what it means. Because money has been paired with being able to buy lots of things, such as food, an unconditioned reinforcement, toys, conditioned reinforcers, and much more. The point is that when I say a generalized conditioned reinforcer, that just means it's been paired with many conditioned and unconditioned reinforcers. As an RBT, you will probably work with patients who have some form of token economy. If you think about our society, we live in a giant token economy. We get some sort of stimulus, usually money, our paycheck, after working for a little while. We're not reinforced for every single day at work. We're not given money for every single day at work. Instead, over time, we earn it. We get that money, then we exchange it for goods. In a token economy and an ABA intervention, conditioned tokens are used as reinforcement. These conditioned tokens are conditioned by trading them in for reinforcer. Tokens become the reinforcer that we deliver for correct responses. Tokens being the reinforcers can be a very good thing. They're easier to deliver. We don't have to give them an M&M every time or a toy every time they get a correct response. It also allows us to spread out big reinforcement delivery, delays the reinforcement delivery. We don't have to provide items or activities all the time or after every correct response. They wait to earn them with tokens. And in this way, it's a little more natural. A lot of kindergarten classrooms, and a lot of classrooms in general, will use token economies for the class to earn, like prizes or parties. And, again, it's a little bit more like our natural society. And it also improves the person being able to wait for reinforcement. But first, we have to condition those tokens. We have to make sure they mean something. The analyst, at first, may set it up where they are trading those tokens in a lot, maybe even after every trial or after every program. Because we have to condition them. We have to make sure the person understands that those tokens mean something. Then gradually, we're going to require more and more responses to gain the tokens, and or require that person to have more tokens to gain things. Again, there's a lot of minutia to this. But the big idea is that we have to condition those tokens first. We have to make sure they mean something. Imagine giving a patient 100 tickets but never letting them buy anything with it. Those tickets would become totally meaningless. They'd be totally neutral. They don't mean the person is not going to work for them. But if they know that tickets can be turned in for prizes or for breaks and stuff like that, trust me, those are going to become conditioned and they're going to want to work for them. So, Here's some reinforcer properties or types of reinforcement that you may use. Edibles. Food, right? Skittles, grapes, jelly beans, chocolate chips. When we're using edibles as reinforcers, we want to be able to make sure, especially for items that may not necessarily be healthy food, we can break them up. M&M minis, for example, I prefer to use M&M minis versus regular M&Ms because they're much smaller. Likewise, if I'm going to use, let's say, a donut, I could probably make a whole donut last an entire session. We're not going to give them the whole donut after 10 correct responses, but maybe just a little piece. The point is, remember, we want to be able to make them small enough, the pieces, so that the person doesn't become satiated on them. And we don't want them eating 5 candy bars in the session either. So we're going to want to make sure we're breaking the pieces up. Sensory reinforcement, such as massages or odd textures, cush balls, brushes, those can also be very effective, especially with our patients that have some sensory issues. Tangibles or toys, or other things. Tangible just means something they can hold or feel or engage with. Example tangible items might be toys or trinkets, a favorite object, stuffed animal, whatever. Basically, it's something they can hold or feel. We can provide that to them for correct responses. Access to activities or stuff like that. Games, sports, recesses. And finally, social reinforcers. Interaction, hanging out, getting to talk about something. With some of my older patients, I'll use talking about video games as reinforcement. I won't talk about video games at any time during the session unless they get a certain number of trials correct. That may seem a little weird or a little odd, but remember, I'm working in intervention. Okay, I'm making sure they can do what I need them to do to address the deficits. And then, once they can show me that, once they get the correct responses, I talk about video games, which increases their future likelihood that they'll engage in the responses I wanted. So all these are different reinforcer properties or types. But remember, reinforcers are going to vary among people. What one social reinforcement might look like for one person is going to look totally different for another person. What one person likes as far as tangibles are concerned, another patient is probably going to be totally different. It's going to be very idiosyncratic. I cannot say for sure that my favorite toy would work over with this other patient. We just don't know. Reinforcement is determined by its effect on the behavior. If you give a person a favorite or this particular toy for something and they increase their behaviors, then we can know that toy is a reinforcer. So how to find reinforcers? We can ask others, but this could be problematic and the reports may not be accurate. Although I have to say they're probably going to be a little more accurate if you're talking to another technician on the case. We can do general preference assessments, providing choices for the individual and what they want to work for. We're going to go into a little more detail about what this means. We can also do reinforcement sampling, where we allow free access to items and see if they play or use the item. Basically, you are allowing them some access to see if they like it. So, let's talk about 3 types of stimulus preference assessments. The first one is we ask the patient. Open-ended, what would you like to work for? And asking about specific items, force choices. Do you want cars or trains? As a general rule, I use a lot more force choices. Because if I ask something like, what do you want to work for? They can answer with anything. But as far as the three types of stimulus preference assessments we're going to talk about, it's important to know what open-ended means. It basically means you're asking, what would you like to work for? There's also something called the free operant observation. Okay, that sounds complex, but really what it means is that the patient has free access to a range of activities and reinforcers. All are available and can be seen. Items are not removed. This can be done in a very contrived or very naturalistic way. In a contrived situation, you provide samples and place items in view and within reach. You record how long the patient engages with each item. Again, as an RBT, you're probably not going to be doing much of this as far as this kind of specific method. But it is important to know. Also, you have naturalistic one, where we use the everyday environment and don't really intrude. We're kind of like being a fly on the wall. We observe and see what items they play with and how long they play with it or interact with each item. The only real difference is that you're just kind of letting it flow. You maybe go to a playroom and see what happens. You don't have to get the items out. You just see what the person goes for. Benefits of the free operant operation is that the person has access to items. You don't have to remove the items, which means there's less likely to have behavior issues, and is more systematic than simply asking. Again, I don't want you to feel like you have to know this specifically, but just understand that there are several types of preference assessments that have been studied and researched. There's also trial-based methods. We will present stimuli, possible reinforcers to a patient in a series of trials. We'll measure certain things such as whether they look at it, hold it, or engage with it. And then we categorize them into high, medium, or low preference. Again, I want to reiterate, as an RBT, you probably won't be doing much of this, but it's still good to know. So, trial-based method 1, the single stimulus presentation. We're going to present the items one at a time in random order and record the patient's reaction to the item. This is a really good thing for those who have a hard time selecting two or more stimuli items or activities. Remember, we're presenting one at a time. Trial-based method 2 would be a paired stimuli presentation. Basically, it's a forced choice method. We present two stimuli at the same time and ask the person to choose one. Each stimulus is matched with every other in the set, comparing each item to each other. So, we rank in order from high, medium, and low. So basically, if you had like 4 items, you would compare item 1 with item 2, item 3 with item 4, item 1 with item 3, and so forth, and see which one the person mostly went for. 3, trial-based method 3, is the multiple stimulus presentation. It's kind of like paired stimulus, but with 3 or more stimuli together. You begin by asking something like, which one do you want the most, and then repeat through the items. Again, I want to reiterate, as an RBT, you're probably not going to be doing much of this. You're going to be simply asking the individual or patient, which one do you want to work for, the blue one or the green one? Do you want the candy or the melon? Okay, do you want the toy train or the toy car? Before trials. But it is important to know that there are systematic methods for preference assessments. In the end, as you get to know the patient, what you're going to find is that you will start to know what is reinforcing to them. It is your ultimate goal as an RBT to be able to work with that individual in an effective way. So you will get to know what actually works for them and be able to use it throughout the session.